good morning to all of you, and I want to thank you all for your being here today virtually and taking just a little bit of time out of your morning to answer some of the critical leadership questions that we all have, which is part of our, this is our second part of the webinar series, responding to critical leadership questions, leading through uncertainty. And we had a great first session last week with Nat Irvin and Brad Shuck, and couldn't be more excited for this second week as well because we have two awesome panelists again. And so I'll introduce them in just a moment, but I do want to say thank you to our executive education team who is helping put this together, and thank you to all those again who are attending, as your questions and your insights will be valuable to this, as we'll have time for Q&A at the end. But I want to introduce our panelists this morning. We have two fantastic ones again that I'm so thankful that they took a few moments of their time to be with us this morning. The first panelist that we have this morning is Virginia Denny. Virginia is an Assistant Dean of Integrated Corporate Programs and Executive Director for Online Learning in the College of Business. She has long overseen the University of Louisville's executive education programming and has over 30 years of training and consulting experience. She has helped create international learning systems, strategic planning processes, and internal consulting systems for businesses in Louisville and beyond. She also has degrees in psychology and organizational communication and a master's in human resource education. Virginia, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thanks, Zach.
And our second panelist is Vaughan Scott. Vaughan is a professor in practice for the College of Business and a successful entrepreneur who also oversees our U of L's Consult MBA program. Vaughan has an MBA in global management and 20+ years of experience in wealth management and financial planning. He has taught multiple management courses for us here at the University of Louisville, and among his many accomplishments, Vaughan was awarded an advanced certificate in family business advising in 2017 by the Family Firm Institute for his comprehensive knowledge and expertise in family business. Vaughan, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So apologies to you both because I had to keep the bios and descriptions somewhat short, but these two have quite the accomplishments that we could go on for days about. But that's not why we're here. We're going to talk about some of the questions that were sent in over the last week and a half by members of our community regarding leadership. In particular, this panel is going to look at learning and adaptation, which is obviously so critical to where we're at right now. And for the record, we are recording this on May 4th. Certainly things are likely and hopefully will change over the coming weeks, but it certainly emphasizes the importance of being able to adapt to whatever comes our way. And these two panelists have some great insights into that. So let me just get right into it. We've got several questions here today that were submitted. Again, we've kind of removed some of the identifying markers from these questions just to keep people's anonymity, but I'm going to try to keep the language as much as I can with the original. And our first question comes from a manager of 20 years who says, I've led my team through the financial crisis of 2008, which strongly impacted our industry. I've also attended numerous seminars and graduate classes on change and crisis management, yet I still feel underprepared and overwhelmed when leading my team through the last 2 months. Why do these current challenges feel so different? And what can I do as a manager to make sure I put myself in the best position to lead my team through the days ahead? Virginia, let's start with you this morning.
Well, first of all, let me say to this person that you're not alone. A lot of us can echo exactly those feelings, and you think, well, I've got a lot of years of experience, or I've done these sorts of things before. This is a game changer. I want to talk about two things just briefly. One is cognitive load that I'm learning about through my daughter, who's working on her master's and researching it right now. And cognitive load is all about how many things our brain can handle at once. So if you think about it, this is unprecedented because it's affecting our home lives and our work lives and everything around us. So what we have to handle in a day's time in our brain has shifted dramatically. We have a lot more coming in that we're juggling. If you came in early, you heard Zach talking about his two-year-old and baby, and he's home with them. So in addition to everything else, he's managing that. And then all the technology, if you heard Vernon talking about, now he's using his iPad and his computer because this works on that. Someone else has different connectivity issues. We're just bombarded with lots. So that's part of the reason I think it feels different. But what I really want to hone in on here is the word feel,
Mhm.
because I think we're well served right now to pause and think about the feeling part of this. And a lot of us are working so hard and so fast that we're not allowing ourselves time to do that. And if you tune into your emotions, you'll find that this really is something very unusual. And it's a way to keep yourself healthy and to help your team. So I'll give you a couple of little tasks you might try for yourself. One is when you get up in the morning before you start your work day, just keep a little index card or something beside you, or you can put a little sticky note on your computer system and just note, what am I feeling? Put the date and make a note. Do an emotional check-in and maybe another one during the day at some point, and begin to tune into that. You may begin to see patterns. And even as a leader, we have our good days and our bad days. And the more connected you can be with your team about this side of things, the emotional side of things, the more effective you can be together. And so the second thing I would urge you to do is to allow some check-in with your team in that way. I've been doing it one-on-one. Basically, I dial them up and I say, tell me how you're doing. Tell me what's going on. Yeah, I've had a rough technology day too. Tell me more. We have just a brief conversation. Those connections seem to be helping. I don't know, a couple of my team are on here. They can tell me later if it's not. But it certainly helps me. And then I know where the team stands and how things are flowing. So that would be my, I urge you to just step back and feel as well as think during this time.
I think that's a great point. Vaughan, what are your thoughts there?
No, I couldn't agree with Virginia more on all those issues. And I believe, we've been so trained that things there have to be, always have to be scientific explanations, or there have to be, experiences that we can draw upon. And even those of us who've had 50 or 60 years of experience in an industry, it was 100 years since the last pandemic. So it really is a situation where, we don't know what the future holds. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I believe that the challenges, as Virginia said, is we really have to be in touch with the feelings that people are having, in a very large sense. Because when we think about it, all of a sudden now we're thinking about survival, or we're thinking about health issues. And even though we can take great care of ourselves, we still have now the pressures of worrying about either parents or children, depending on where we are age-wise. And all of our team members have these same concerns. And for many of us, this whole idea of survival or really having threats to health, other than, we feel like everything is so manageable. But we've seen, with things like this, there are no certainties, and it really can affect anyone differently. There are plenty of examples. And even though the percentages are very low, the consequences in large measure are very high. And so all of these, as Virginia said, really heightens our emotions. And I think it's, at the same time, I think that one of the things that I hope we feel also, or I hope that we can recognize, are all the positive things that are going on around us. Because that's the other thing, as Virginia's saying, when we get in touch with ourselves and we get in touch with what's really going on, I would submit to you that there are probably far more positive things that are occurring than there are negative things right now. And you think about the things that people are doing, teams pulling together, teams really finding ways to help others. It really is in many ways very inspiring, and at the same time, I do believe when we look back on this, we will, of course, the loss of human life is tragic, and any unnecessary loss is unacceptable. At the same time, I believe there will be so many things that we learn, so many things that we feel in the future better for having gone through such a difficult period in all of our lives. And I think being in touch with that, with ourselves, as Virginia's saying, but also really being mindful of how our teams are experiencing all this, because their experiences are different than ours. And the more we can really try and understand what their challenges are, the better suited, and the better they will feel about being on the team.
Sure. Well said, Vaughan, and I agree with you. I think the word there too that we're really going to focus in on by the end of this discussion is opportunities, right? Where are the opportunities for growth and expansion? And while that certainly shouldn't come at the expense or by overlooking the seriousness that some people are experiencing right now in this crisis, certainly it would be kind of inappropriate to not look at the opportunities as you kind of look at how you position yourself coming out of this. And so we'll definitely have an opportunity to probe that a little bit further. But I want to get into the next question here, because it's really about how do we move forward with some of the circumstances that we're in and continue to be in. And it says, like many, this question from a writer says, like many, my organization has adjusted to comply with governmental mandates. That said, many of the changes we anticipate making in the weeks and months ahead will resort back to our leadership team. What are the primary criteria that we should be considering before deciding or implementing any changes in the current climate? Vaughan, let's start back with you on this one.
Yeah, I would say the primary consideration is your people. And as Nat and Brad talked about last week, which I thought they did a fantastic job in their discussion, we really have to think about our people first. And fortunately, our customers will understand. I mean, there's more forgiveness and understanding now than ever before. And I think internally, we feel the pressure to get things back to normal. The reality is that I don't think we're going to know what normal looks like for a long, long time. And we have to, people keep looking for, well, what's the new normal going to be? What's the new? And I think the reality is if we're authentic and honest with our teams, we can tell them that we don't know, but that we're there for them. And so I think as we think about what we need to do, we need to be very deliberate, take it a step at a time, but we also really need to think about our team first. And if there are pressures coming, external pressures coming, we really need to shield them from those pressures. If customers or clients are putting pressure on our team to move at a pace that they're not comfortable with, or that we're not comfortable with, then we as leaders need to step in and really address those issues directly, whereas perhaps we've been more comfortable letting team members address those issues. But I think as long as we put the team first, we're going to be in a much better place. And most importantly, we're going to show them how much we care about them, which I think is the most important thing that we can do.
I think that's a great point. Virginia, what are your thoughts there?
Well, Vaughan, I expected you to go the strategy route, or the people route, but we can switch that. So first, let me say that Vaughan has done a really nice 15-minute video that is free and is available on our website, and we'll get you all the information. It's also out, I believe, on GLI's Crisis Hub website, which we're trying to put pieces out there for people. Zac's out there and some videos as well. But Vaughan's done a really nice piece to help you think about this strategy question. And it leads me to think about what we as leaders have experienced in the College of Business at the University of Louisville, especially a couple of weeks ago. Well, actually throughout the several weeks now, there have been tough decisions, really tough decisions about furloughs and do we do classes online and what do we do about our students? A lot of heart, a lot of care and concern, and a lot of decision making. So most leaders right now are tired. We'd log off at 10:30 at night when we finally got done, and it's all virtual. So there's a lot of intensity for leaders. But when you ask the question about primary criteria, I agree, people, they're the ones that are going to help you accomplish whatever the next goals are. But I'd also like to say, as you think about things, a lot of folks seem rushed to make big decisions right now. And there are so many unknowns that I'm urging pauses for that. Just pause for a minute and ask, does this have to be decided now? And usually I urge people to ask, do we have enough information to make a well-founded database decision? And the answer is probably going to be no right now. So that's one way to think about it. And then balance this with, our dean is quoting this old quote you've probably heard, never waste a crisis. So when we talk about opportunity, there is so much opportunity right now. And if you just pop your head up and look around and look at it from a positive standpoint, what are the opportunities that if we act right now, we might make a difference in the world, or we might help the people that need us. So I would urge you to balance those two. So when you have that criteria question, people first, then look for opportunities, and make sure you're not jumping to a decision that's not necessary at this moment. And you could wait a little bit longer to get more information.
I think it's
On the other,
I think that's a really important point, Virginia, because you think about, I mean, so many of the decisions that are being made right now, many of them are necessary for a short-term survivalist perspective. But when you start to look into that long-term planning, you really have to start to let all that information flow in before you can really solidify something that will guide you going forward. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, as long as you can, you know, realistically wait to get that information, make sure that you're being well informed, and then moving forward with that, I think is going to be really helpful. Vaughan, did you have something that you wanted to add there?
I was just going to add to that. I think the also, you know, it's important to think about, you know, we are really operating, or have operated, in 3 different modes in the last several months, and you know, survival mode, which Virginia alluded to, but there are also tactics and strategy. And I think the one thing we don't think about often is that with our teams, we can actually divide and conquer. So some of us maybe need to be working on survival, others maybe need to work on tactics, and others on strategy. And fortunately, we're getting to a place where many businesses have the opportunity to think about those, or at least start to think about more than just the survival mode. And I think it's important to think about how do we divide and conquer as teams to really be able to address these issues.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's why I mentioned too the date that we're recording this on, because I think we're right at that point where several things are starting to change from a business standpoint and what we're able to do. And that's why I think this writer was even mentioning as well, that a lot of this has been mandated, but now there's a lot more autonomy starting to come back in as to how to proceed. And I think certainly you two have nailed it there as to what to be really thinking about. I want to move into our next question though, because it really keeps us thinking about the team-centered approach. One of our writers here says, over the last 7 or 8 weeks, our team has made significant changes to our operations like most. My team in particular though has been slow to adapt. They realize the need, but often we struggle with some of the specific changes to our policy and procedure. What can I do as a leader to help my team be as flexible as they possibly can? So a question there about flexibility. Virginia, let's start with you on this one.
well, I love this question, Zach, because you and I have co-facilitated resiliency. Actually, one of the attendees in this webinar this morning, in their organization, and I applaud you for it. Annually, for many years now, we've been teaching resilience to leaders and to upcoming leaders, and I feel certain that the organization is feeling the benefit of that right now, because that is such a critical piece in what we're working with in our day-to-day lives. But when you talk about building resilience and flexibility in the team, it really, the thing I would ask you to start looking at first is trust. And that was a topic in the last webinar as well. Teams that trust each other can flex with each other, because they know that they have each other's backs. So that's a starting point. Unfortunately, if you haven't been working on building trust when there's not a crisis, right now it's going to be considerably harder for you. So looking at trust, understanding that if there isn't a lot of trust there, that you have to address that first. The other thing is communication. And there was, in the very first week we went remote, I ran into a little piece that came out from GLI, from Greater Louisville Inc. And it was a little tip sheet, and it said, create some structure in your day. And I thought, well, you know, that is a way to help me and the team. So immediately our team put in place, first thing in the morning, just check in a chat. No, we don't meet, we just check in, say what's going on, and share some information. And then at the end of the day, we have just a brief touch base in a meeting. That is time so well spent for helping a team be flexible, because they're sitting at home with very little input about what's going on in the organization. Let them see it coming. communicate and provide enough information that they can flex with you. Otherwise, just to dump a new change on them is too much.
I think that's perfect, Virginia. It actually reminds me of something that a study we did with students one time, looking at structured autonomy, because the idea of, students and employees in general, we all say we love the idea of autonomy, but when it's just completely free reign and there's nothing to guide us, I think that does create some additional problems. So the idea that structure and flexibility are somehow opposing forces, I don't necessarily think that's true. I think you're absolutely right. We need at least some of that structure in place to make sure that we can guide the actions going forward, and that not just being the case for college students, but for adults as well. Vaughan, what are your thoughts there?
No, I think both trust and communication, I think you're both spot on. Trust and communication are obviously of paramount importance. And really, if trust has been harmed in some way, the best way to redeem it currently is, even if you haven't been, have genuine interest in understanding what's going on with people and really listen to them. Not listen because you have something to say, but listen because you're genuinely interested in what they have to say. And there are a lot of techniques around that I think are important. The most important thing is that it has to be genuine, because people will know if you're faking it. People will know if it's not genuine. And it's interesting that the other word that I think about when we talk about this is really ingenuity. And so, we can be innovative. We talk about innovation, we talk about creativity. I think all of these are important parts of really, being flexible. At the same time, I think it's important that we think about that the motion that's implied in ingenuity, and that is that we're actually going somewhere. At the same time, we need to set the expectation that we are going to make mistakes and that we are going to fail. And if we are going to fail, let's fail fast, let's learn from it, and let's do it quickly. Rather than having a long drawn out failure, let's have open, honest dialogue. If we see that something isn't working, let's just accept that that's part of the experiment. I mean, there's a great book, if you haven't read it, called Anti-Fragile by Taleb, ironically the same author of The Black Swan. So great book about this notion. And essentially what Taleb says in Anti-Fragile is that you think about your organization like the two-headed hydra from Greek mythology. And for those of you who remember your mythology, basically if you chop one head off, two heads grow in its place. And that's the way organizations today really can grow, is to intentionally, make decisions that they know. Obviously, we can't do anything that's going to put, the organization at peril, but we can make a series of small bets. We can really try to grow through making mistakes. Obviously, we don't want to do it intentionally, but at the same time, when we do, we want to accept that it's part of the process. We want to set the expectation that if we're going to try new things, that we're going to have failures, but that's all part of the process. And candidly, I think the best thing leaders can do is openly talk about our own failures, our own shortcomings, however small they may be, to talk about them openly and to accept the responsibility, but to also say, this is just an example. We're all going to do this. We're all capable of this. Just please, let's really make the best efforts, but let's also support each other when we make mistakes, because we're all going to make them.
Absolutely. And I think both of you are definitely on the same page there, in the sense that we're going to move forward, but we also need to be comfortable with that uncertainty, which was kind of the whole point of these series of webinars, is how do we navigate that uncertainty? Because sometimes we're not used to it, right? In many leadership positions, we assume that, we know all the pieces, or at least most of the pieces, to make informed decisions. And right now, that's certainly something that is different. I also think we would be naive not to take advantage of some of the resources in this room. Many of you are in either leadership positions or in positions where you really have to be resilient, or you have to be flexible. And so if you have an opportunity, I did put a question very briefly in the chat function. Love to hear your thoughts there from the participants in the room or the audience, because we would be happy to hear more strategies, because we're sure this is not just an exhaustive list. Also, feel free to include any questions that you have in there, and we will have some time at the end for those. But I want to keep us moving forward here. And so looking at our next question, this comes from an employee who writes, currently my organization has suspended all external contracting, including our traditional training and development partner. Meanwhile, our corporate office has tasked managers to oversee remote learning sessions to help our employees with critical leadership skills like self-management, team building, etc. What advice do you have for leaders who are being asked to oversee employee learning or other developmental efforts when we ourselves have little experience in facilitating these types of activities? Vaughan, I think it's your turn. Let's start with you.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. All organizations are obviously having to revisit budgets, or just about every organization, even the ones that are really thriving. And there are a number of businesses out there that these are actually, you know, the best of times for them. And so they're having to come up with new ways, you know, to bring on board people in the midst of this challenge, and in the midst of the crisis. You know, I think for those that are constrained in terms of what tools we have available to us, I think the important thing to really think about is that there are a lot of great sources out there. You know, TED Talks are a great source of good information and learning. The Khan Academy, you know, has a number of resources. There are other, you know, there are other resources out there that are absolutely free. Google Scholar is a great resource for, you know, that's free to anyone. It's just scholar.google.com, where you can, you know, those who say, well, you know, that's great, I want to find something that has some academic rigor behind it, you can fairly quickly determine which ones do or which ones don't. I think we just have, again, we have to think differently about it. At the same time, again, in the context of supporting our people and helping them learn, you know, part of the reason, you know, you heard Virginia's background, it's very diverse in terms of her education, you know, and part of the reason I think she's been so successful and does such a great job in what she does is she does have a wide variety of interests and a broad background of experience, intellectually and otherwise. And I think we need to, in the past, I know I have seen many businesses really support education and learning that maybe benefits the business. And if the team member can show how it's going to benefit the business, then the business will pay for it. And I think we need to think very differently about that into the future, because the reality is that the challenges that we're going to face are really much more complex than we've seen. I mean, the next 10 years are going to be more challenging than the last 100, easily. And I think at the same time, you know, the fact of the matter is that we need to stop applying linear logic, which is just learning about the things we think we need to learn to then be able to support the organization. We need to really broaden our horizons and really ask better questions. What does our ignorance look like? What are the things that we don't know, that we should know? What are the things that maybe a different perspective could actually help our team, because we don't have that kind of experience or background? Things like, you know, in Virginia has this, you know, psychology, sociology, even having folks study these things at times like these are really, really important. I believe they've always been important. I believe they're more important now than ever.
So Virginia, before I ask you to speak to that, so this was actually one of the first questions that we had written in about 2 weeks ago. And I thought there's no better person in the world than Virginia Denny to answer this. So I would love to hear your thoughts here on the question, but also some of Vaughan's thoughts as to how we proceed with some future learning opportunities.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you both for the kind words. You know, as I look at who's attending, and we have some really long-term clients on this call, and what they do in their work every day is remarkable. These are internal learning and development people, and they have, over the course of years and years, truly transformed culture and the way that leaders lead through strategic learning and development. And let me emphasize the word strategic. Our clients that we work with in our day-to-day work and normal times, our strategic clients, or they do strategic work. Not one of them has backed off of the work that they're doing. We haven't had a single call like that. Things are postponed, of course, and we're going online with some things. But when it's strategic, it's a whole lot easier to support it. And that means that you know what and why. So that's what I suggest to you as you think about this and go back and really work with this question. We are natural learners. Everything Vaughan said, I would have said, Vaughan, if you hadn't said it first. So ditto on that. But what I would suggest you do is go back and say, given where we are now, everything is shifting on us. What is it that is most strategic for us to learn? And then ask the why. And when you ask the why, then what we like to do is ask the why and then connect it to measures that can show impact. And for example, there's a person on the call that has shown that people who go through a certain training program are the ones that turn out to be the leaders that are promoted in the organization. Imagine that. So there are things like that that you can quickly connect. Everything's changed, so you don't have easy training buttons to push. So do what Vaughan said. We've been doing webinars for organizations on how to be a strategic learner and own your own learning. And that means you ask the what and why questions, and then you go out and you curate your own learning program, just like Vaughan described. You go to Google, you look up, find a YouTube, talk to a colleague who's great at what you need to learn how to do. The free resources are mind-boggling, and then go from there.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of comments in the chat box there about LinkedIn and how right now I think they're offering some free resources, but they also have some paid subscriptions that you can do as well. But certainly I think your point there is so key, Virginia, is that if it's strategic, then it's not just an expense line that can be easily scratched off, right? If it's strategic, it's part of your culture, it's part of who you are. It's just like removing a limb. You can't do it, but you can really think about, okay, how do I make sure that, you know, I'm able to still do this? I'm still able to leverage that opportunity in very different times. And I think that's absolutely right. If it's part of your strategy, it'll stay. If it's not, then you'll have to find a way to rework it going forward. And so I think that's a perfect point. Vaughan, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I thought it was great, and I do think that you know, we also, as we look at sort of the big picture, you know, we really need to elevate the importance of learning and development. You know, I think we training and development, and it sounds like obviously this group, you know, has a great history of that. That is always going to be important, but I think as we start to think about the future, it's really a broader, you know, it's broader than just training. It's really about a broader learning. And I think thinking about things as a learning and development program or learning and development department. And it's no surprise that the fastest growing role in the C-suite is the chief learning officer. Yeah. And that role, you know, is going to become more and more important as time goes on, whether it's a truly bestowed title or an honorary title on someone who's taken the ball and taken the initiative. But that really is a crucial role in any organization today.
Great point. All right, so next question here, and I'm really excited about this one because it's going to get us into the second half of our conversation. It says, I've often heard and personally experienced many people are hesitant to change. I understand that part of this stems from personality, but our organization seems to have more resistance than most. I believe it may be attributable to parts of our culture, and I think it's related to some of the things we just talked about. But the specific question here are, what are some barriers or contributing factors from organizations that may impede change or make it more difficult for employees to adapt? And I don't remember who's going first this time. So
it's Virginia's turn.
Virginia's turn. Go ahead.
Okay. Can I flip that question?
Absolutely.
So the question was, what are the barriers? And I'd rather flip it and talk about what's present when you can move rapidly through change. And Stephen M.R. Covey wrote a book years ago called The Speed of Change, or Speed of Trust, I'm sorry, and showed that I think it was 260% increase in effectiveness of companies and efficiencies when the people inside the company trust each other. So we're back to trust again. And Zac, I feel like you ought to be answering this question because I know you have a lot of depth here as well. So look at trust, but also look at past history. People have long memories. So if organizations have effected changes in the past in a way that was not effective, people will remember that. And you as a leader have to show them, not tell them, but show them how this time it's different. And so that's a big piece of that. So people who've experienced it in the past and done well and gotten through it, survived it, are going to be more nimble now. And I'll keep that short because we have talked about trust already.
Absolutely. And I think, something that Brad Sheck mentioned last week was about the legacy part of all this, that people are going to remember years and years from now how our organizations handled this time period. And I think that's certainly true going forward, but I also think it's true from where we've been. You mentioned kind of already that trust is accumulative, and I think we're all familiar with that. But we're really starting to think back on some of those experiences right now as kind of a turning point. We're thinking to ourselves, okay, can I trust that my supervisor, my boss, my CEO has my best intentions when he or she did X, Y, or Z? Now, assuming X, Y, and Z are positive, I think that the outcome is generally positive, right? The trustworthiness is there. But you're absolutely right. We have to take into account the history and then also be able to acknowledge that history, because certainly history is different right now. And I think you're both doing a good job of explaining how that's so. Vaughan, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, you know, I do think the probably the most important thing that comes to mind as it relates to all this, and again, completely agree with everything both of you have said, is that it is a time where we can actually listen to people if we haven't listened in the past. And I think we have to acknowledge and be honest with ourselves. Have we been as open to listening in the past? And I always remind myself as a leader, I have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And so you know, I think that it's a time where we can really take stock and just ask questions of people honestly and in earnest and say, you know, do you feel like this is an issue within our organization? You know, what are the things, you know, what are the challenges that you have seen that this type of an environment has created? And then the most important question is, what do you believe that we need to do to fix this? Now, you know, the good news is that a lot of these questions can be asked in a way that you know, you can get a large number of responses. At the same time, you know, really even better if leaders really work with their leadership teams, put these simple questions together, and then work with each other to make sure that they understand the exercise and the importance of really listening, and then having conversations, you know, ideally via platforms like these where you can see people's faces, because, you know, you can't always, you know, the text in a response or the context over the phone don't always tell you as much as looking in somebody's eyes do in terms of how they feel about things. And it's important that we really, if we're going to try and break down some of these barriers, that we really do it in ways that are going to be constructive into the future, and certainly have to make people feel like there aren't going to be any consequences, you know, for them being honest about their concerns, as long as they're constructive in the way they approach them.
Sure. And I think that's critical as well, right? Thinking about how we present these barriers, how we really approach these barriers, because if we see them as kind of going back to the word we used earlier, as opportunities, I think people are much more likely to buy into kind of overcoming and kind of taking advantage of those opportunities than if we were to see them as personal obstacles or personal issues that we have with members of our team. And I think that's where we really get into a downward spiral that is less constructive.
And I apologize, Zach. One thing too is that the way that we can then demonstrate that we're actually listening is we can report out to the entire group, even if that's via email. Hey, we had this listening session last week. Here are the 5 things, and here are the people who shared them with us. You know, and it need not be the usual suspects. It need to be people who maybe aren't as known for speaking. Here are 5 things that you know, very talented people in our team have provided us insights on, and thank them openly for bringing those to our attention.
Absolutely. I know certainly here in the College of Business, some of my best supervisors and bosses do that in a very small way as well. They just quickly repeat. So what I'm hearing is, you know, ... and just allowing that validation, making sure that the person knows that they were listened to, even if it doesn't amount to significant changes long term. That feeling of being heard, I think, is so important, especially right now. Virginia, did you have anything else you wanted to add there?
No, I think that's great. Great point.
So our next question actually comes as a continuation from last week, and something that Nat Urban brought up that I think was one of the highlights of our first session. And it says, during part 1 of this webinar, one of the panelists mentioned a future change, including the possibility of supply chains shifting their priority from efficiency to resiliency. And the question here that was written in, it says, my question is 2 parts. First, changes like that seem massive and are not done by one organization, let alone one person. What then can individuals do to contribute to large-scale changes such as this one? And I'll save part 2 of that question until you both have a chance to weigh in there. So, Vaughan, let's hear from you.
I think the biggest mind shift that's needed to accomplish that, and many things that we're going to need to do into the future, is really thinking of ourselves as a series of federations and a combination of teams. So, you know, it really is the conventional thinking and the conventional wisdom has been that we really need to be, you know, one organization. We need to be all and do all to first, you know, whatever it is that we, you know, we need to know who we are, what we do, and we need to do that better than anybody. And I think the reality of the situation is that we need to think about our construct now in terms of federations. Who can we collaborate with? Who can we partner with? Whether that's formal or informal. Who are the folks that can really add value to us? But also equally importantly, how can we add value to others? And that's both internal and external. So inside, you know, inside the organization, you know, even though we may be a series of teams, it's really important that ultimately everyone see that we're all working towards a common goal. And so, you know, I think, again, we tend to have had this kind of holistic, we're going to provide everything and be all things to all people. And I really believe, especially with massive shifts like this, the only way to really think about it is to think about ourselves as a federation and a series of teams as opposed to, you know, a one shop, one size fits all.
Sorry, Virginia, what about you?
So the question was about large scale changes in team resilience. So this is a time, I said earlier, never, you know, the phrase that's floating around everywhere is never waste a crisis. This is a time where teams can experiment. For a little bit of a moment in time, all bets are off and we can experiment. The way to build resilience during this time, in my opinion, is to allow time for reflection and learning. So as you throw out an experiment, and to Vaughan's point, it may be partnering up with a competitor. It might be breaking down barriers inside an organization and transforming the way you think about things. It might be, get this, giving things away instead of selling them. That's a huge strategy that's out there. We're all experimenting right now. But the experiments will only take you so far in building your team and building resilience. It's the reflective learning that comes as part of that experiment that's key. So I'll give you an example. In our small unit, executive education unit, that very first week, everyone went virtual. We started creating tools, video and online tools and webinars, and we transformed, and one of our instructors is here, and man, I love you. They put their courses that they were teaching live online in a snap, and the evaluations just came in and they're great. So that experiment worked, thank goodness, for our customers. But in the process, what we're doing behind the scenes as a team is we're saying, what did we learn from that? What did we learn from that? How can we do it better next time? What's different? How will we use what we just learned? That's the key, I think, in building this capacity for the future. I don't think it's going to settle down a lot when it comes to this fluid change, and we have to learn constantly to draw from that.
Absolutely, and I think that word that you use there, fluid, is so perfect because it does feel like it's not going to ever quite settle, right? The ripple effects, but there's certainly going to be some calming to the waters of sorts, where we can really start to make an impact via some of the practices that you just mentioned. So Vaughan, Virginia actually kind of got into that second question there, but I'll extend it to you as well, and that is with the team resiliency. So our writer specifically wanted to know, can it be taught? And I think Virginia already previewed the answer in that, yes, you can certainly improve and teach team resiliency, but what other strategies do you have for helping that perception or that culture of resiliency to permeate out throughout the entire team?
You know, I do think it's critical too that we support one another. You know, that's that's one of the key ingredients, in my opinion, is that we really, when we see someone stumble, we're there to catch them rather than to trip them. And I think that unfortunately, there have been a lot of misperceptions that have been created over the years in the way people can elevate themselves, you know, that we really need to I guess another way to think about it is that I think, unfortunately, whether it was intentional or otherwise, we created a lot of zero-sum games. In other words, we created a lot of games where someone had to lose in order for someone else to win. And that's true in business, it's true in teams, it doesn't really matter. At the same time, the amazing thing is that we're really seeing the businesses that are really thriving and adapting better, and the teams that are the most resilient, even becoming more resilient, are the ones that have adopted the abundance mentality. Instead of worrying about how big of the slice of the pie that I'm going to get, whether it's recognition on my team or otherwise, and we just figure out how to bake more pies, we're all going to be better served. Same is true, as Virginia said, competitors are looking at collaborating. People who never, really had maybe had reason to work together in terms of supply chain. I'll give you an example of this. Obviously can't name the companies, but there's a company here in Southern Indiana that's given away almost 5,000 gallons of hand sanitizer. And they ran out of ingredients at some point. And another company from across the river, when they found out about this, sent some of the ingredients that they need. And another company, in Jeffersonville, Indiana, sent some additional ingredients. And so, there are lots of ways that we can rise to the occasion, and we can think about the fact that, we want to embrace teams that are going to be productive, and we want to embrace team members who are going to promote positive action, positive thought within teams. I think now more than ever, having anybody who is not really, and for no good reason, working, with the team, that's a situation where, unfortunately, we've always needed to address those issues more than ever. We just can't have that type of cancer, on a team. There's too much work, too important to be done. And fortunately, as bad as this has been, there are so many more people who see the positive things that are occurring, and really people who have maybe been less resilient to change recognize that, I just don't have a choice. Maybe I'm not as comfortable with it, and maybe I just need to learn some new things in order to become more comfortable. But at the end of the day, it really is about figuring out how we can work together and really create more of an abundance mentality, whether it's for our organization or for our individual teams within it.
No, I think that's absolutely right, Bonnie. When you think about, this perception of not having a choice, I think a lot of people have felt that over the last couple of months, is that, look, it's adapt or die type mentality with many of these organizations. But now we're starting to see where, the choices are getting fluxed back in, where we're starting to get some options as to best strategy. And I think a lot of the things that yourself, Virginia, and then also Nat and Brad last week have talked about is really trying to be, you mentioned being genuine, being authentic in that strategy, but also kind of laying in the creativity there, because I think this certainly lays an opportunity for creativity. And so I wondered if either of you, and we're going a little off script here, but wonder if either of you have strategies for creativity to help kind of make the most out of what are sometimes very limited resources right now. What are some things that people can do to really make the most out of those limited opportunities so that they're positioning themselves to be better off after this is over?
Ooh, I like how you go off script, Zach. That's great. So creativity is something that we're all born with, but a lot of us think that we weren't. And it's something that we can all access as human beings. During this time, it is my personal experience, and I'm not speaking from science here, that you have to create space and time to be able to allow yourself to be creative, because we're reacting, and backing off. One of my colleagues takes a walk twice a day to think. Well, that's where the creativity comes from. In fact, you heard from him last week. Those kinds of situations will allow us to be more creative. The other thing is, if you come at it with an experiment mentality, then I call it the one-time pilot. That's my strategy. Some of you may have heard me do it. Well, let's pilot this. You can get a yes to almost anything for a pilot because it's an experiment, right? And then you limit the risk and you get creative with it. So there are ways to do this, and encouraging your team to think creatively with you will expand the richness of that. And it's also fun. It's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Vaughan, what are your thoughts there? Anything else you want to add to that?
No, I couldn't agree more, and it's interesting. Virginia's mentioned a couple of times this notion of pausing, and I'm a big proponent of that too. You know, the feeling is that we have to do things. You know, we have to focus to be creative, and sometimes that's true. Sometimes we can create that environment or that space, but also sometimes the pause is really what's important. I was actually just watching a TEDx last night called "How to Get Your Brain to Focus." It's Chris Bailey is the one that. And he did it, I think, in Manchester, England, although he's from Canada. And it's really interesting. I thought it was going to be about how to get better focus, but the reality is it also talked a lot about creativity and just how literally taking times to put our phones down, to shut down our devices, to take a walk, to do these things where we disconnect from all the technology, actually promote creativity. It's really, it was really fascinating for me to think about. But I think it's also important that we empower team members to take that time too. We enjoy that often as executives and as leaders. We need to make sure that if we can, we build that into, you know, certain roles that's not feasible, but anywhere that there is that possibility, you know, giving people the opportunity to do that is really important. I have a good friend and colleague who runs a business, and I've done a lot of work with the business and with him. They have about 350 employees, and they have actually created time, and they do manufacturing. And so you don't ever want to shut a line down in manufacturing. Well, they intentionally take breaks in part to really foster this creativity. They intentionally take time and they seek input, and the value that they've been able to drive out of that has been really remarkable. Yeah. The other thing I would suggest for those of you who have budgets is there is a gentleman that I met out of Columbus, Ohio, named John McLean, and John did a program for myself and for other members of my Vistage group. It's a CEO roundtable group for those of you who may or may not be familiar. But he did an amazing program on creativity and really worked with our team in different groups. And we had a couple of our colleagues that had, you know, those types of folks are out there, whether it's John or others like him. There are folks who can help organizations with creativity. The most important thing is that you really obviously need to make sure that they have also an organizational development background and organizational development understanding, because unfortunately you can go off in a lot of different tangents and have people who don't really understand the value of structure, the importance of structure within organizations. But it really is a lot of it candidly can come from within. It's just creating that white space, true white space in that time for that to be creative for you and for your team members. Absolutely.
And in Virginia, I can't help but notice we've used the word pause probably 3 or 4 times. I'm starting to think back to some of the mindfulness stuff that you and I have actually done, or you have facilitated while I've been next to you for many times. Any thoughts there on how mindfulness impacts this and how that could be a key part of our approach as leaders going forward?
It's the part about the emotional check-in that I was talking about at the beginning really was another way to address that. There's clear research now that really good leaders are mindful leaders, and the ability to be in that present moment with your people allows you to listen the way that Zac and Vaughan described. It allows you to respond to people in heartfelt ways that build trust. There are so many benefits, and one of the greatest benefits, it helps you as a leader, as an individual, cope better because you're dealing with that moment. And if you can learn to be in the moment, it's very powerful, and it's not that hard to do. There's a million apps for it now. There's an app for that. Yep. So you can go on and train yourself to do that work.
Absolutely. And I don't know which one it is, but I actually saw a commercial last night. LeBron James has a mindfulness app, or he's associated with one. And so I think it's growing in popularity, certainly. And hopefully that means it's going to grow in its use, because I think you're absolutely right. There's a real value to be had there with mindfulness. All right. So I'm most excited about these last series of questions. We kind of thematically organized them, and we call these the looking ahead questions. We had some last week about kind of future opportunities, future challenges, things that people are anticipating. And so I'll just read to you one of them here. It says, I subscribe to the belief that everything happens for a reason. I see the current crisis as terrible, but also a moment for self-reflection. This person had not even seen your two's talk yet, but I think they're spot on there with that. And it says, what types of things, though, should leaders be focused on regarding their own development? And I guess this person really focusing on their own kind of self-reflection here. And what advice do you have for personal growth or learning opportunities during the current crisis? And so I think, Virginia, it's your turn to lead us off.
Well, I'm going to go stray just for a quick moment from that topic to a broader one. I didn't want this webinar to end without all of us thinking about those who've been laid off, furloughed, those who are between jobs in this incredibly volatile time. These opportunities, in fact, I have a good friend, we had a conversation about what it does to your mind to suddenly be expendable for a period of time, or to think you might be expendable for a period of time. These are huge, huge pivot points that we can be damaged by or we can learn from. So for the folks on this call, I don't know if any of you are being affected by that, but I'm going to flip back to the same theme of being aware and learning. So in these times of uncertainty, whether you're a leader coping with it, with whoever's left in your workforce, or you're actually affected and not working, in both cases, the development of you as an individual is still paramount, because that makes you flexible, creative, and effective. So to do that work, to do that learning requires, I think, at this point in time, a lot of reading. Vaughan just mentioned TED Talks. The content is out there. Nobody's worrying about the quality of the backgrounds. They're just getting it out. And there's some great content. If you can sift through that, challenge yourself every day with a new idea. I find myself going back to old books that I've read in the past, philosophers, different foundational thinking right now. That's helping me as a leader to reflect back on those things. And then every day, at the end of the day, ask, what did I learn and how can I use it?
I think that's great, Virginia, and I'll actually put you on the spot after this is over, because one of the things we're doing as part of this webinar series is sending out a recommended text or recommended read from the panelists who participated. And so I'll be curious to see which one you pick for that, because we'll send that out to all the people who are attending today. Vaughan, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I do agree on the, as we want to make these huge leaps forward, I think it's really important that we not forget those who have been displaced in one way, shape, or form, or those who have lost family members in the process. And I think those two groups especially are families who have been, who we know have been affected in one way or another, to reach out to them first and talk with them. I was amazed. One client that I've done a lot of strategic work with had to lay off 150 people. Now their workforce was 200. So if you can imagine, the challenge they were faced with, one of the owners literally called every single person that was laid off, every single one of them, told them what, that they wish this was unavoidable, that it was not. Now they're back up to 60% now. And they've had only a couple of people decide not to come back. But you think about the hard things are what we need to do sometimes, and especially today. And I know we don't have time for anything, but at the same time, I think we need to think about those things as we look to, what we want to do to the future. The other things that I think are really important as we look to the future is that I think we've enjoyed the benefits of globalization and enjoyed, for a long time and in large measure. But I think we need to also be mindful of the fact that we're now a global society, and that there are other implications that come along with that. There are other levels of social responsibility that exist today that probably didn't before. And I really believe that we need to really be thinking about this balancing of responsibility as being both between social and financial. And whereas understandably, when we're in survival mode, we need to make sure we can keep the lights on and the bills paid. That's totally understandable. But we really need to make sure that we have this balance, so that as we move forward, we're thinking about things maybe in a way that we hadn't thought about them before. And we think about that balance of both financial responsibility and social responsibility.
Absolutely. And I think both of you are spot on there with thinking about those who are impacted most. And I would say, knowing both of you personally, I would credit that to the two of you and your emotional intelligence. And so if I were to add one thing there to that, particularly at this point in time, I think that's so critical. If we can personally focus on our own emotional intelligence, and it was briefly brought up last week, but that's an area that is not easy to develop, but certainly there are resources out there for it. And there's research that indicates that it can be developed and improved significantly for those who really put in sustainable and strategic growth in that area. And so that's just my plug there, is that's an area to really focus on. I do know that some people are starting to have to go into other meetings via the chat. And so I just want to give you, the two panelists here, one last opportunity to share your final thoughts on just where we're at right now, some of those opportunities, again, that you see coming up. And one thing I asked the panelists last week that I think was really helpful, give us one thing that we can do today to either be a better leader or to better position ourselves to adapt and to learn in the current climate. So just a quick reflection, and then your one strategy for our participants who are attending today. So Vaughan, we'll start with you.
Oh, go ahead.
No, ladies first.
Okay. First, I want to say, just in the reflection of what we've talked about, that we haven't talked as much about reaching out and learning from each other and resourcing each other. We're kind of isolated, physically isolated, but be sure you keep your network up and flowing and functioning. Very, very important during this time. And I would like us to be part of your network and part of your resources. If you, and I look at the names on here, and you're my resources too, I learned from so many of you. Let's keep that flowing, and if you need anything, reach out. There's probably something we can do to help you, or we can connect you with someone who can. And there's not a whole lot of billing going on right now, so we're happy to help in any way that we can. So that would be my urge to get you to think about that, and to look at the website. GLI has a crisis hub with lots of resources on it. We're feeding that, and there are things that you can tap there, and I'll leave it at that. I do hope that you all are well, and that you will pause today and take a moment to reflect.
I think it's well said, Virginia. All right, Vaughan, what about you?
You know, I think that it's also important. I, again, applaud both of you for taking the time, and Zac, for you for putting this together. It's been fantastic, and I do agree. I think we really need to connect with one another, you know, more now than ever, and learn from one another. But I also think we need to break down the hierarchy in that. In other words, we need to think about who can we learn from, who maybe we haven't learned from in the past. And some of the most inspiring leaders that I know, they learn from the people who take out the trash at their business. They learn from the people, you know, who you know, do the tasks that nobody else wants to do. They really do take the time to understand. And you know, there's a great book that probably all of us have read at one point in time called 7 Habits by Stephen Covey. And one of those lessons was on empathic listening. And so I would urge all of us to go back and read that chapter again, because it really, the basic premise of it is we want to seek first to understand, then perhaps we can be understood. The thing that's different today, that I would say, is that we need to recognize that the best answers are probably going to come from a collection of voices, not just the voice in our head.
No, I think it's absolutely well put, Vaughan, and I want to thank both you and Virginia for this morning. I know I'm speaking for the entire room here, but I think it's an accurate summary, and that we definitely appreciate your insights, and I personally learn a lot every time I get a chance to speak to both of you. And so thank you for taking an hour out of your morning this morning to answer some of these critical questions. And want to quickly plug our next session, which is our last session, at least scheduled for now, will be part 3 of this conversation. We're going to focus on communication, particular things like communicating difficult decisions, communicating some of that bad news, but also really thinking through strategic communication and how you can use that as a tool to get your team through the current crisis. And we have two great panelists again next week in Kristen Lucas and Kathy Gosser, who bring years of experience and a lot of great insights that they'll bring to the table. And so very excited to speak with them next week. Otherwise, again, thank you both for your participation, for your help today. And thank you to all who have attended this. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you back next week. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Take care and stay safe.
Stay well, everyone.